Warning: viewer discretion is advised, as there may be some descriptions that some listeners may find upsetting. Not suitable for younger listeners.
Welcome back to the dark side of the Dean. Episode 5, The Cheese Wire Killer. 8:35 p.m. on the 29th of September 1983, taxi driver George Murdoch radioed his firm's dispatcher and said, "I've got a fare for Cutler." His taxi would never arrive at the destination. A few years earlier, George had been made redundant, and still being in his early 50s at the time, he needed to find other employment. This led to him becoming a taxi driver. His wife, Jessie, was worried about him taking up the job, but he'd reassured her, saying that he would never resist a robber. Dodd, as George was known to his friends and family, picked up two young women from Aberdeen University shortly after 8 p.m. 29th of September 1983, and took them to Queen Street in the West End area of the city centre. A few minutes before George dropped the young women off, a man was being thrown out of the upmarket New Marcliffe Hotel after they refused to let him use the bar because he was wearing jeans. It was a Thursday evening, late night shopping in Aberdeen, the height of the North Sea oil boom. The streets around the city centre would have been thronged with people hitting the shops, restaurants and bars after work, maybe even doing some early Christmas shopping, when George Murdoch picked up what should have been his last passenger of the night before his shift ended. And a small group of teenage boys did report seeing George's sky blue Ford Cortina leaving Queen Street shortly after the still unidentified man was thrown out of the New Marcliffe Hotel. The car headed away from the city centre on the 6-mile journey toward the Aberdeen suburbs. It would only make it 2 miles into that journey. George pulled the car into Station Road, Pitfoddles, and it was here that George's passenger attacked the 58-year-old. A pair of cyclists witnessed part of the attack, but this being the days before mobile phones were widely carried, they had to leave to find a public phone to contact the police. Just after the cyclist phoned the police, another passerby came across George Murdoch, laying in a pool of blood next to his taxi. George had severe injuries to his head and face. The passerby used the taxi's radio to call for help. Police and an ambulance arrived quickly, and George Murdoch was pronounced dead on arrival at hospital. In an article in the Express newspaper in 2018, Alex Mackay, George's nephew, described his uncle saying,
"Dodd was a gentle, likeable and kind-hearted man, usually with a smile on his face."
What followed was one of the largest and most frustrating murder investigation in Grampian Police's, as it was known at the time, history. Detectives quickly discovered that money had been taken from both the taxi and George's wallet, and a cheese wire was found close to the blood-splattered taxi. This led to some to start referring to the murderer as the cheese wire killer. At that time in Aberdeen, cheese wires were used and carried by workers in a number of different industries: the oil, pottery, and fishing, amongst other things. The cyclists were able to give the police a description of the man they saw George struggling with, which matched the description of the man who had been thrown out of the hotel. The man was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, slim and about 5'7" tall, with smartly cut hair and wearing dark clothing. This man was seen a couple of minutes after the attack, running toward Aberdeen with blood dripping from one of his hands, scratches on his face and a bruise under his eye. And again, another 5 minutes later, still running toward the city. This led the police to carry out a major operation that involved stopping the supporters of Aberdeen Football Club as they arrived at the club's stadium, Pittodrie, for a match. The police were there to check the hands of supporters, for the damage that was caused during the attack on George. But despite all the efforts of police, the trail of the murderer started to go cold. Then, 17 days after the attack, detectives received a report that a man who looked like he'd been running and who matched the descriptions the police already had was seen in the Mr. Chips takeaway on Great Western Road in the Manifield area of the city, about a mile from the murder scene. Frustratingly for investigators, because this report came so long after the attack on George, only one other person from the chip shop could be traced, but they did manage to add to the description. A leather zip-up jacket, dark narrow bottoms, and a local accent. This is the last account we have of the suspect, who would be in his 60s or 70s now, and at the time of recording the case remains unsolved. Despite this, the police and Mr. Murdoch's family have never given up hope of catching the killer, and it is widely believed that someone in the city has information that they have never come forward with. Following an appeal of information in 2018, Detective Inspector Gary Winter of Police Scotland's major investigation team told the BBC,
"It is clear that despite the significant passage of time, people still remember the tragic night George was murdered and want to help give his family the closure they deserve. We are looking to establish different uses for cheese wires at the time, an extremely unusual item for any person to have in their possession. The route taken that night by the killer and the violent nature of the assault are also key features of the case. Someone out there knows what happened to George, and I hope our appeal, bravely supported by his family, has served as a vital reminder that it is never too late to come forward with information."
George's nephew Alex Mackay told the Express newspaper around the time of the appeal.
He'd been made redundant a few years before his death, and as he was still a relatively young man in his 50s, he became a taxi driver to pay the bills and to take care of his wife and himself. 35 years is a long time, but it's never too late to see justice be done, and our family urges anyone out there who thinks they might have information to please get in touch with the police.
The violent nature of the murder, the sensationalizing of certain details of the case, such as the cheese wire being found at the scene, and the fact that the case still remains unsolved, has hung over the city for nearly 40 years. A noticeable stain on Aberdeen's reputation as one of the safest cities for locals, visitors, and tourists in the world. But it is said that the murder had the largest impact on George's wife Jessie, and she never fully recovered from that night. She passed away in 2004 and never got to see justice for her husband's murder. If you have any information that could assist police with this case, you can contact them directly on 101 or anonymously through Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Join us next time when we'll be taking you back to the late 1500s and the infamous Aberdeen witch trials. Alex Mackay portrayed by Kenny Luke. Detective Inspector Gary Winter portrayed by Alistair McCrone. Edited by Richard Skinner. Produced and written by Cliff Hughes. Narrated by Alec Westwood. The Dark Side of the Dean.